Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Alyssa.
And I'm Arran Rogerson.
And today we are discussing the Greek god Hermes, most commonly known as the Herald of the gods. But Hermes has a much more nuanced and complex symbolic structure. As an archetype, he draws us into experiences of the underworld. He's a crosser of boundaries, a patron of shepherds and thieves, and a figure who inspired the alchemical hermetic arts. He's a trickster. He's full of cunning and ambiguity. And we often see that archetype really helps to shake up static structure and rigidity. So we'll take a dive into Hermes' background, some of the mythology, and some of the symbolism that's associated with him today.
Hermes is one of the Olympians, so he's one of the main 12. The deities in any pantheon, they're always made up of a lot of different pieces, and they can be very complex in this way. As Alyssa said, Hermes can be thought of as the god of boundaries or traveling or journeying, as the god of heralds, but also like merchants, orators. He also has some notions of being god of like the pasture or god of farm animals, stuff like that. So there's all these different ways that these different ideas are sort of accumulating and grouping together to form this anthropomorphized object, this deity. And we can see this for a lot of the Olympians. And again, for deities in any pantheon, in any culture, is Hermes is not just one thing. And it's not easy to sort of pin him down as being always, he's just this thing. He's just the god of heralds.
Yeah.
Or something like that. There's a lot of different little details that are added here and there over the history of the myth that pull Hermes in different directions. And you have to kind of wonder, how are all these things related? And we can understand this complexity as sort of the accumulation of collective projections over time. Hermes starts out as a heap of stones that is at every crossroads or is at certain places throughout the land to mark certain boundaries. This heap of stones is thought of as being the manifestation of a certain kind of deity. People pass by the stones and they throw another stone onto it, and this thing eventually evolves into a more of a sculpture, which is called a herm, which is where Hermes, the name, comes from, sort of stone heap, stone sculpture. And so this is evolving over time, and as it evolves, it accumulates a lot of this projective material, essentially, of people kind of have their own projection of what this god is and what he represents, which is why he'll have so many different facets of being god of merchants, god of heralds, god of journeying, god of boundaries, god of all kinds of things. So we're going to get into that complexity and try to unpack what is really at the core of Hermes, or what are all these different projections sort of circumambulating, and what's like the psychological sort of significance of that.
Yeah, the evolution of at least tracing this idea of like the Hermes and the stacking of the rocks, ties very directly into the evolution of him as like the soul guide and the crossing of the boundaries and the movement between those. That isn't just something that's more concrete and real, like, I'm actually at a road that's now intersecting or crossing another road, and he sort of rules over that, but actually there's this more subtle aspect of life after death and the transitions and the boundaries, the kind of veil that exists between the world of the living and the world of the dead, which of course in Greek mythology is this incredibly rich area of thought and imagination, and of both conscious and unconscious material. So many stories, it's like when you die, it's sort of like life 2.0, like, Eurydice dies. Orpheus wants to save her. He goes into the underworld. He kind of gets the permission from Persephone and Hades and can actually bring her back. But of course, some things happen. So there's this idea of like death in at least Greek mythology that carries a very different nuance. It isn't just, death and that's it, or you're in hell or anything like that. And there are not a lot of individuals who cross those boundaries very often. And there are even less individuals who kind of mediate between those boundaries.
You mean individuals in mythology?
Yeah,
In
yeah.
general?
Yeah.
Like Hercules, for example, does travel to the underworld. So like that happens,
Yeah.
but that's not
Psyche
a
as
super
well.
common
Yeah.
theme.
Yeah, you're not supposed to be doing that. Like, and some of the individuals who do already have these kind of like grander stories where they go on to become something greater, like Psyche kind of being raised up to be a goddess. But like Hestia, I think there's some relations between Hecate as more of this like crosser of boundaries as well, where we see more of that connection to Hermes. But what does it really mean for us sort of psychologically to consider both the movement and the sort of transgressing of those boundaries that mark both things in our material reality, but also areas that are a little bit more sort of mystical in nature.
Right. And we make this point over and over again in our discussions. Most recently with alchemy is this idea that the external world and the internal world are sort of interwoven.
Yeah.
In the sense that you can't really separate the idea of the objective physical reality of roads and boundaries, like literal boundaries in the land of like, this is my land and this is his land, and there's a boundary between it, or this road marks the boundary between these two different city-states. That's kind of a literal interpretation. And then you have this sort of internal idea of like, well, there's boundaries within my own psychology of what is conscious and what is unconscious, or there's boundaries in my transformation of like between being a child and being an adult, or from being a single man to being a married man. There's like boundaries that we cross that are sort of more metaphorical.
Yeah.
And it's easy for us to pretend that like, well, those things aren't related at all. Like the boundary within like a literal territory it has nothing to do with a boundary that's psychological or that's sort of metaphorical. But they are interrelated. And if we examine the past and we sort of try to unpack how people really experience their reality, what it was like to be conscious in the past, these things were blended together. And it wasn't as simple as having this sort of this materialistic notion that there's an objective reality. So we can see how Hermes being, in some sense, on the roads at crossroads, but also being this psychopomp that travels between the living world and the underworld. Those are related. Those are both sort of projections of how we make sense of our reality. And it's not clear that we really treat a boundary between two pieces of land and a boundary between two parts of life as being actually different. They're sort of the same thing to us.
Yeah, I like this connection with this idea of like initiation, like moving from being a child to an adult in all these different forms, or these kind of next levels of maturation that we go through, and how we can think, and I think a more like classical Jungian sense, that often these initiations or these movements into newer parts of ourself, or being taken deeper into, say, like unconscious material that needs to be addressed, is often led by a type of psychopomp figure. And if we're looking in a more classic Jungian sense, as I mentioned, I think you see those associations with like anima or animus figures. So kind of like inner feminine or inner masculine.
Right, soul guides.
Soul guides.
That's what psychopomp means,
right?
right? That might even be like the translation.
I think it's pretty literal in that way. But often the trickster, the archetype of the trickster, is also related to this nature of being a psychopomp, because by the essence of like their being, what they do is like create transformation. They sort of shift the narrative. They break down the structure. And so you have someone like Hermes, I think, playing that role often in a mythological sense. Like here he is coming to support Perseus and really moving him through this like initiation of defeating Medusa, et cetera, et cetera. But that type of like trickstery nature that really is very paradoxical, very shape shifting, can kind of emulate where he needs to go or where it needs to go, then allows for like the birth of this new attitude. And that feeling of initiation, I think, can be very closely related to this archetype of Hermes, or the archetype of the psychopomp or the trickster.
So we have Hermes, just to break things down a little bit, we have Hermes as herald of the gods. We also have Hermes as god of boundaries,
Yeah.
or god of traveling, journeys, this kind of moving between places. And we also have Hermes as the trickster. And there's a kind of 3 different like main descriptions of Hermes. I would say they're all interrelated, which is interesting. But that's kind of like who Hermes kind of is. And so let's get a little bit deeper into Hermes, the figure, and let's go with some of the imagery associated with Hermes, or the symbolism. What does Hermes look like, for instance?
I think you always know that you're seeing an image of Hermes because you see the caduceus. And it's such a popular, striking image. We've kind of seen it continued integration in the culture past just Greek mythology, but I'll get into that. But the caduceus, this wand that has these intertwined snakes running up it. You might see it also having kind of like its own wings at times, but it's this long wand that always has the snakes, and they're moving in a kind of like double helix around each other, creating this
almost like DNA.
Yeah.
DNA, and the snakes can be interpreted depending on which mythologist you might talk to. The snakes can be interpreted as either fighting or
copulating,
mating, copulating.
Yeah.
Again, which are kind of interwoven in strange ways. But the snake as a symbol is interesting, right? And we see the snake appear often when we have myths that are kind of exploring like the underworld or truth.
Yeah, or like very like primordial, very like core essence of very dynamic unconscious material, or developments of like creation mythology.
Right.
It's just considered like an extremely ancient symbol that can represent both like wisdom, but also you have the Ouroboros, and so you get this notion of like cycles of life, and everything is where we're born from is where we return.
Right.
It just carries like an intense dynamic psychic structure, the snake.
Or the snake in the tree of knowledge of good and evil that gives the apple, or not doesn't give the apple, but entices Eve to take the apple.
Right. And there's both like the kind of tricksteriness of that, the
Absolutely.
kind of the devil, and of Lucifer, I think, as
Lucifer's
a figure.
trickster, the snake is kind of like a trickster character. Like, eat the apple. Like, don't you want to have the power of the gods?
Well, I also think like the way it moves too. If I just think like in this, it just, the imagery of how a snake and its body kind of shifts and moves around, unlike any other animal in a way, is so fascinating. And like, what is that imprint on one's psyche? It definitely brings that feeling, that kind of essence or the aura of that kind of trickster nature, because it shifts and moves, it strikes fast. And I think that's part of what we're dealing with when we're tapping into this kind of archetype of Hermes, especially. And I think one other connection, at least personally, that I make with the caduceus is how it also reminds me of some of the imagery of like the rising of like kundalini energy, and this idea of like that there's a snake like the base of the tailbone of each individual, and when you awaken this kind of like primordial life energy, it moves up a central channel and then does this kind of like double helix movement up the spinal cord, something like that.
Okay. So the kundalini energy is sort of like snake energy moving up the spinal cord.
Yeah. And there's like the movement, there's like a main energy channel. So you might see that as like the main part of the wand. And then there are a masculine and feminine, or like a lunar and a solar energy channel that intertwine, and where they connect at certain points is, I think in theory, supposed to be where chakra points are. And so, I mean, we'll get more into the trickster and the kind of bi-gendered nature, or this kind of more holistic idea of like the mixing of all of these coming together. But to me, the caduceus evokes that as well.
Yeah, so the snakes as Ouroboros, as chaos, the snakes as knowledge or truth,
Yeah.
because chaos contains within it often latent truth to be discovered. Snake is sort of energy. There's kind of like that fertile, revitalizing energy of the sort of reservoir of chaos that the Ouroboros represents. And that sort of double helix is very strange, and it's very strange to discover that like that's the shape of DNA. Almost like this sort of sacred geometry of the double helix is like a pretty interesting thing. But this is sort of the primary artifact that Hermes kind of wields, right? That's most strongly associated with him.
Yeah.
I guess well, personally, what's more strongly associated with Hermes is the winged sandals.
Yeah, the winged
That
sandals.
seems like more of a stereotypical image.
Yeah.
Of Hermes.
And the hat with wings as well.
Right.
I think they're all pretty stereotypical in my mind, but there's this sense of like he has this lightness to him, the flying nature. He can move quickly.
Yeah.
And because he is a herald of the gods, because he's moving between these different boundaries, he has a type of imagery that's really different than other gods who might kind of move in like chariots or I don't know. Zeus must have like a million times just like appeared as whatever form he wanted.
Sure.
So, but with Hermes, we see the winged sandals.
Right. It's a good point that the imagery of someone on a chariot, for instance, it's like it's very commanding. It's very in your face.
Right.
It's not quite as agile or nimble.
Yeah, it's like you're gonna like burst through the wall.
Yeah, right. So someone arriving on a flying chariot is like, well, look at that like glorious royal figure. It's like, here I am. Whereas the winged sandals, you kind of get this idea of someone who could just sort of like appear and then like slip away.
And then again,
like, here I am. Try and catch me. And they're like, ooh, I'm gone.
Well,
like,
and there's that nature of Hermes being also like the patron of like thieves, and it's like his tricksteriness.
Right.
He needs to be sly.
Right.
From the moment he was born, we'll get into this though, that he has this nature of sort of like moving between the shadows and showing up where he wasn't a moment before, and then he's gone.
Right. So a thief, if they had winged sandals, they would be like very effective at just like
Absolutely.
zooming past and like, there's your wallet, got it, bye. Whereas like if you were trying to steal wallets like in a chariot, like riding by people, it's like that wouldn't work very well.
Right. Yeah. I think before we move on, there's just like one thing that I feel is worth noting is the confusion often with the caduceus, with the rod of Asclepius, which is a single staff with one snake wrapped around it. And I don't really know what this says about like our culture or the development of our society, but most people for some reason confuse the two, because of course Asclepius is known as
They're very similar.
Medicine, right? They're very similar, but they're very
people for
but
getting confused.
They're very, very different. And so you'll see, Asclepius is known for like healing and medicine and things like that, and that there are many medical symbols that use the caduceus instead of the rod of Asclepius, or you'll see both actually. And I don't know, these things just happen, accidents, but in some ways they're not accidents. But yeah, anyways, Hermes is not really known as like a healing god or a medical god. So just FYI, if you see that, caduceus is not so much about healing, but that's okay.
Yeah. So what are some analogous figures to Hermes in different cultures? Mercury. This is the Roman version.
Yeah, I mean, with the Roman pantheon, things are always very... It's always hard to split the hair sometime, I think, because when Greek mythology and culture started moving into the Roman world, it totally like revolutionized the way that they approach these things. I think their gods were much more like, I don't know how to say this. They're just sort of like amorphous. They were more like these natural forces. They didn't always have as much of a strong story or a strong personification, I guess you might say. So a lot of it was just like very much adopted over. But there's some gods who you see like, because they're older, I think like Neptune / Poseidon is like an example of this, where you see maybe like a greater Roman cultural line through it. But from my understanding, Mercury and Hermes seem like very like a one-to-one, and a lot of the stories are just kind of readapted to the Roman culture, and the names are just sort of shifted around. But I think Thoth is the more interesting one that we get the connection to. So Thoth being an Egyptian god of wisdom and magic and science and art. So you start to get into that nature of the aspects of life that are kind of unknowable and unseeable, yet at the same time can be like gifted through insights or the crossing of these boundaries. Of course, Egyptian culture had this huge focus on life after death, and also the kind of the arts or the magic that's connected to that. So you see this really dynamic link between Thoth and Hermes, which plays a lot into the alchemical development of the Hermetic arts and what alchemy was, at least the more like Greek Egyptian version of alchemy.
Right. So we're highlighting, again, this connection between wisdom and the dead or the underworld.
Yeah.
And being a trickster.
Yeah.
There's that connections here. So Thoth is sort of a god of wisdom, but he's also connected to the dead. There's this notion of kind of like forbidden wisdom or hidden wisdom, wisdom that's buried. It could be thought of as just sort of going out into the world and uncovering the wisdom that's out there, but also like going in yourself, going into your unconscious and uncovering that golden shadow, that notion. But also the trickster connection to wisdom is something that will keep coming up as the ways in which being a trickster leads to insights, or the ways the trickster shakes things up. And when you shake things up, when you break the frame, when you break the way that you frame your reality, and you have to reframe it or come up with a new frame, this leads to insight or knowledge. So this connection to Thoth is interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I think some of Hermes' main stories are a nice way to also explore more of the archetypal structure and to understand it. We don't always see these really dynamic, interesting myths tied to the birth of each of the gods, but Hermes, I think this is one of his classic ones and sort of expresses the nature of the divine trickster that he is. So when he was born, like basically like the first day he's born, because he's a god, he's already like very conscious and can do all these different things.
Sure.
And so he decides to go and steal Apollo's kind of like heavenly royal cattle.
It's golden cattle. Aren't they like made out of gold or something like that?
I don't know. Probably different versions express them in all different ways. But, you know, Apollo, who might have then been viewed more as like the ruler or a patron of like shepherds and the flock.
Right. Another strange connection is like, oh, Apollo is like god of cattle.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, what? Like, Apollo's another episode.
Apollo is
similar
another
complexity.
episode. Yeah. But he steals the cattle without Apollo knowing. He's a little baby. He like goes and in some versions, he slaughters some and makes, 12 offerings to the gods. And I guess, does that mean that he included himself? But anyways, Apollo realizes that his cattle are missing and he divines like what happened. And he realizes, oh, it's Hermes. But before Apollo can come and catch him, he slips back into his wrappings and his cradle, and Apollo's demanding, where are my cattle? And the baby did this, and the mom's like, no, like that's not possible. And so the story ends with Zeus sort of stepping in and just feeling very proud, I think, is often how it's expressed. Like Zeus is just thinks it's all very funny, but ultimately it's like, hey, Hermes, like give your brother back his cattle, and you guys make up, and they do. But in this process, Hermes creates the lyre from a tortoiseshell and parts of the heifers that he had killed, and he strings it and he starts playing it, and immediately Apollo's like, oh my God, what is that? And around that time, there seems to be like a shift between the god of the shepherd and the flock becoming Hermes. He actually like takes the cattle and he gives in exchange Apollo the lyre. And of course, as a god of music and poetry and all of this like artistic beauty, Apollo takes on the lyre, and that becomes like a very central part of his own story as well. So we see that trickster nature from the moment he was born. He was kind of running around, moving through the shadows, tricking others, but in this very lighthearted way. Hermes is always extremely lighthearted.
Right. Right. And so this interesting connection between Apollo and Hermes. Apollo, not really thought of as like structure. Like Apollo's not really like a fatherly figure, where like Hermes is like pranking like a dad figure, and the dad's like wagging his finger, like, what are you doing? But it's more like Apollo almost manifests this kind of like higher light of truth and beauty, and the idea that Hermes, the trickster, kind of messing with Apollo and being a trickster and shaking things up and pranking him, essentially, like stealing his cattle. And that this prank that he plays on Apollo actually leads to this creation of music for Apollo.
Yeah.
It's kind of implying this notion of the trickster shaking up the status quo of things. The trickster showing up and being like, I'm going to mess around with the inherent structure of this social scene or of whatever sort of entity is here. And by doing that, people might be like, what are you doing? Like you're rocking the boat. But what happens when you rock the boat is it actually leads to wisdom. It actually leads to a new perspective. And in this case, like it gives birth to like this powerful music for Apollo. Like he gains this like inner power, gains this sort of this insight that he didn't have before. And you can see this connected to the other trickster gods, right? Like Prometheus stealing the fire and giving it to humans is like the trickster Prometheus provides consciousness to humans.
Yeah.
There's other versions of this sort of notion of the trickster stealing fire or just the trickster leading to some sort of revelation.
Yeah. Well, I think also there is a connection between trickster heroes, and Odysseus, I think, is like a good example of this. And I guess he's like considered a great grandson of Hermes. So that immediately creates this lineage of tricksteriness. But as a trickster hero, he employs these different techniques to totally shake up what has been established in like whose idea was it to create the Trojan horse and put the Greeks in it? And then they were actually able to like, turn the tide of the war. It's like, that was Odysseus. It's like, whose idea was it to, tie ourselves to the bottom of the sheep and then be able to blind Polyphemus? It's like, that was Odysseus, So there's this way in which the tricksteriness, when it comes out psychologically, it makes things uncomfortable. It turns things on its head. It can be very paradoxical. It can, go completely, a 180 from where things were going. And that can cause a lot of tension in somebody. It's often why I think trickster figures on a psychological level can feel deeply disturbing.
Yeah.
But it creates the potential for like new flows, new energies, new things to unfold. So that dynamic transformation, usually with some, I feel like that is something that's very simple. It's not like this long, drawn out plan. It's almost like the trickster can come in, like snap his fingers and boom, things have changed. And then I like that kind of feeling of like almost like the magic of the trickster. This isn't like an individual who's just planning away this really intricate thing. It sort of just flows from the trickster archetype inside of us that suddenly everything's shaken up. Everything's been turned on its head and it brings transformation with it.
Right. You can kind of see this with the way that like humor works almost. It's like when you actually try to examine humor and say like, what is happening when something is funny? Like, what does that even mean? There is some aspect of humor that is sort of messing with the status quo or messing with the structure of reality even. So like a lot of jokes are funny because like they're putting forward some image that sort of is absurd, meaning it doesn't make sense or doesn't fit in with reality very well. And you can see that a little bit of messing with reality. Like a lot of like comedies, like a lot of like funny movies nowadays, they're not really depicting something that looks really real as much as they're sort of depicting a reality in which things are cartoony and ridiculous.
Right.
And, things happen that like would never ever happen in real life. There's something about Mary is like a really famous comedy, and there's like this crazy dog. He takes drugs and bites onto like Ben Stiller's crotch, and like he's like shaking the dog around trying to get the dog off his crotch, and the thing is like this is like ridiculous. This would you would never believe this would happen in real life ever.
Right.
If someone told you like, oh, this happened to my friend, you'd be like, no, it didn't. But in the movie, in the myth of the movie, it's funny because it's messing with the structure of reality and kind of creating this sort of separation of like messing with what is considered to be true just a little bit. And there's kind of like, there's something sort of humorous. It's like ticklish, but you can also see how this can quickly turn to like horror, like humor and horror are connected, because if you take horror movies, for instance, they're also messing with the structure of reality.
True.
And nightmarish things happening.
Yeah.
It's like, that doesn't seem real, but it's freaky.
Right.
And
it's like just real enough. You know, it walks the boundaries, actually.
There's a boundary, exactly.
That's an interesting
that uncanny
idea.
valley.
Right.
If something is so far from reality, who cares?
Right.
But when it's actually sort of messing with you, where it's like it could be real or it could be fake, that's when things are funny. Or if they're like extremely like destructuring, they can be terrifying.
Right.
For instance, like in a scary movie, if you'd think what would be the scariest thing would be like a bear chasing you, like some monster is going to eat you, right? But like scary movies aren't about like bears like chasing you. Often there's something more like the Halloween movies.
Right.
A guy standing outside your house with a mask on, staring at you, is more freaky than a bear charging you.
Right.
And it's like, what's that about? It's like, because reality is falling apart. This weird figure outside your house with a mask on is like, it's making reality fall apart into a nightmare.
True.
Because and it's like what is going on? Like, what's real? I don't know what's real anymore. And this is terrifying.
It's like the psychological thriller that actually like really cuts to the core versus like the type of like horror meets like comedy thriller. I'm thinking of like Deep Blue Sea for some reason. That's one with the sharks, right?
Yes.
With like
and
giant sharks.
Cool J, who's the cook in a gigantic underground laboratory.
But in my mind, I was trying to think of a movie where there are like big animals that are chasing people. And that's what came to mind. Right. But it's too ridiculous, right? Like it's messing with reality, but it's going so far into like a fantastical realm that we see it as like, it's kind of like a joke, and it's also like kind of scary at the same time. You can sort of imagine it, but it's not real enough. But then you think about these more psychological thrillers like Scream or Halloween movies. And then there's this feeling that they're actually walking the line between those boundaries in a much more skillful way. And the image that's actually coming to my mind is like having one foot in reality and having one foot in the, whatever you want to say, in the horror, in the comedy, whatever it is. And I think when an individual or a project or a movie, whatever it is, can straddle that, that's like you've suddenly like constellated Trickster energy in a really powerful way. Because as the crosser of boundaries, as someone who can fluidly move between both, you have to mediate an individual psyche or a collective psyches through it. So you can't just be on one side or the other. You have to be in both. And that, if we just even look at these more pop culture references, that's where things get really exciting or scary. You know, I think like some of the best comedians too have one foot in reality, like they're seeing some structure that we all seem to fit into, but then they're turning it on its head, or they're revealing it in a way that like, oh, nobody talks about this, like that's not very PC or whatever it is, like that's the status quo. That's actually where people really get struck in a really powerful way. Right.
Like it's funny because it's true. And jokes that seem absurd but reasonable. Right. As in like, you know, how much money did you spend on that burrito? If you're like, well, I spent like $30. People are like, what? That's ridiculous. But there's something about it, like it seems like it could be true. There's like, oh, I spent $3 million on my burrito. It's like, well, that's not funny because that's so far from reality that's obviously not true. And so, anyways, the playfulness of that, the playfulness of humor, the way that humor works is that it's playful and it kind of takes you out of your safety zone into some place that kind of feels like unfamiliar, and that's tickling. It's sort of stimulating. And that's what play is, right? Yeah. Is traveling into the realm of chaos. So you're in sort of a realm of order. Everything is familiar. Everything is known. You understand it. And playfulness is sort of venturing into something you don't understand and exploring it and sort of engaging with its components messing with it. And that's what children do, right? And children play because they're learning about their world. And so the trickster is a figure that brings someone into the world of play, or brings someone into the world of chaos in some sense, brings them into the realm of the unfamiliar.
Yeah.
And the same way that children learn by doing this, they learn by being brought into the chaotic realm and having to figure it out. The trickster does this to an adult.
Yeah.
I played a prank on you, or I shook things up, and I brought you back out of your like sort of ossified adult life into the world of children.
Yeah.
And you're learning again now.
Yeah.
There's insight, there's wisdom.
Well, it's interesting that we think about the trickster with this relationship to wisdom and growth, because it's more subtle, I think, with Hermes as a figure, but like that connection back to Thoth, I think, especially to me, is really striking, because it is the nature of being able to mediate these different realities, which Thoth did as more of this god who ruled over like this knowledge of like magic or sciences or art, these things that were discovered, these things that kind of enhance consciousness, that tie you back to wisdom, because he's not a god of just chaos. Some trickster gods do move in more like the chaotic realm, right? We might think of Loki as more of like a trickster god who really kind of doesn't give you a platform for feeling like you can integrate whatever trickstery energy is coming up. But Hermes and in connection then Thoth, I think, have more of a pillar of wisdom and depth, so that what they're doing as they kind of move you between realms, or as they draw you deeper into this place, is that this birth of that new attitude is the ability to feel that there is this depth of intelligence and insight that's coming forward. And that's because something psychologically has outwitted you, you know? It's like, yeah, we can learn and transform in ways that are more like kind of being passed on, like a higher wisdom from a more like, kind of wise, older guru type. That also happens psychologically, but there are ways in which the outwitting or the outplaying also is extremely revelatory,
Right.
and how important that is for us.
Yeah, you bring up Loki, and just an interesting pop culture connection is for anyone who watched the recent Disney series on the Marvel character of Loki. One artifact that Loki receives in the show is a golden sword, and the golden sword is one of the artifacts of Hermes. So Hermes slays Argus, the many-eyed giant, with a golden sword. There's also some versions of Hermes giving Perseus the golden sword in order to slay Medusa. So there's a connection there.
Yeah.
Loki's getting sort of the trickster weapon of Hermes in this TV show, and that's actually part of the Marvel universe as well, in the comics as well. And so it's interesting connections like that. Another connection that I think is interesting, and I read about this a little bit, is Hermes' connection with Anubis. And in terms of his function of guiding souls to the afterlife, right?
Yes,
that's one thing Hermes does. It's one thing Anubis does.
Yeah.
And there's also this strange morphing of Hermes and Anubis into Hermanubis. It's like there's actually like sculptures.
Okay, interesting.
And you get this weird crossover of deities, right? And that's that's what's so interesting. And this can help you understand what deities and pantheons actually are, as they're sort of the anthropomorphized ideals of a culture. And Egyptian and Greek culture obviously crossed over because Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. And anyway, so Hermanubis is like a strange morphing of Hermes and Anubis into the same figure, meaning they're in some ways they're interpreted as being the same god in weird ways, which is interesting. But both Anubis is also thought of being someone who is connected to like the investigation of truth, but also the like going into the afterlife.
Yeah.
And so like there's the connection there that's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's useful, I think, to start to do that kind of like comparative mythological analysis, because you start to see that the patterns reveal a kind of inherent archetype, and there is never going to be like a perfect one-to-one, as you compare the gods, that there are going to be certain essences of a, say, like looking at Hermes, where you can see it represented both in Thoth and in Anubis, and you can do the same thing by looking at like Zeus as an example, it's like, well, what does he relate to in Norse mythology? It's like, Odin, right? As like the ruler of the gods. So it's like, oh, but he's also a lightning god. So then you have Thor as well. So
Right.
you can do this comparison, and I think there's no one exact right answer. You have to like
right. And,
allow for the
I
multiplicity.
mean, Hermes is also connected to Odin in weird ways because like they're both connected to the dead, and they're both like seekers of hidden knowledge.
Yeah. A little trickstery too, Odin.
Yeah, for sure.
I think one point I wanted to circle back to is because you brought up Loki and you brought up the new Disney series. Oh no, spoiler alert.
We're always doing spoiler. I mean,
sorry,
we
guys.
should be more careful about this. Like, we shouldn't just say spoiler alert and then immediately say the spoiler.
Right, okay.
This is a spoiler alert for the Loki TV series. So if you want to stop listening, because you don't want to ruin the series, then stop listening now. But right. What were you going to say?
So in the Disney series, Loki effectively meets all these different versions of himself.
Yeah.
Like there's this whole multiverse of Lokis, and there's like a crocodile version, an old man version, young kid version.
Yeah.
And the real main other version that he tangles with and really kind of is drawn to is the female version of him.
Yeah.
And there's a really central, very important aspect of the trickster archetype, especially viewed as Hermes, where there is the blending of the masculine and the feminine. As that crosser of boundaries, as the mover between worlds, it shows like a wholeness of the archetypal expression that doesn't just move on like one side of the dichotomy or the other. And so the hermaphroditic nature of tricksters is very important because each individual encompasses all of these energies inside of themselves. Like the masculine or the feminine to me are just, it's a universal expression, and we have these varying different degrees of it within us. But if we first and foremost look at the term like hermaphrodite, there's actually some origin to that. There's some story, which is that Hermes and Aphrodite had a child who was a male and was merged with a woman, and was then and the child's name was already Hermaphroditus. But that term, that idea of like a masculine and feminine being merged together, came from the idea of Hermes, which I find very, very interesting.
Right. And just in case you're not making the connection, hermaphrodite is probably a term you've heard before. And hermaphrodite is Hermes Aphrodite, hermaphrodite. Yeah. And so that's where it's come from.
Yeah.
And the crossing of boundaries is another good illustration of this is, the crossing between male and female or masculine and feminine energy is another way of interpreting the archetype of Hermes. And it's not just, that's just one example, but there's also ideas that Hermes is sort of a god of, because he's a liminal god. Yeah, there's sort of this idea of the like traveling back and forth or cycling between two polarities, which again can really relate to like the dialectic or the transcendent function, or going between conscious, unconscious, conscious, unconscious as a method of individuating. But there's this notion of like Hermes being sort of the god of trade, because there's this mediating between merchant customer. There's sort of a god of sexual intercourse, because it's like this sort of mediating between male and female genitalia, kind of like coming together and merging into one being, the child. So you can see that this could be interpreted in all these different ways. Like I said, the golden shadow, the idea of like going to the unconscious, integrating back up into the conscious, going to the unconscious, there's sort of that mediation. You can think of the hero's journey in this way, right? We brought this up before, is that the hero goes from the known world into the unworld, back to the known world, and back to the unknown world. And he's doing this cyclical back and forth from home to the dragon's lair, from home to dragon's lair. And that's actually the pattern of growth. So you can see Hermes is going to be projected onto all these different ideas of liminality and traveling between the two. Yeah,
the imagery is incredibly prevalent in alchemy, where the conjunctio, the conjunction, the union between two opposing principles come together, so that you'll see in a lot of the emblems, someone who looks half male and half female, but they're joined together. And maybe in the previous emblem, they were separate. Like maybe you had the solar king, who's often dressed in red or has like a sun around him, and you have the lunar queen who might be dressed in white, and they're somewhere early in the development of the alchemical process, and then there's a joining of those opposing principles, and that union, that conjunction, is key to the Hermetic art, Hermes, aka, because it's the blending of the realms that seem to naturally oppose each other, yet are actually in relationship. So it's the yin and yang. It's matter and spirit. The core essence of what alchemy is really trying to explore, which is the relationship between concrete matter and like this more inner divine spiritual essence, is that same type of polarity. But the idea is to join them together in harmony, and the movement between that, the ability to transfer yourself from one area to another, to move between worlds, I think is key to why Hermes / Thoth is such a central figure in alchemy. It's that at its core, and it's that liminality that Hermes expresses in both the Greek mythological sense, but also in all these other different ways.
Right. Before we move on to talking about sort of the Hermetica, and because you're touching upon the occult sort of with alchemy, etc. The sort of the shape-shifting nature of Hermes, and sort of, so like in the Marvel universe, Loki, for instance, Trickster, he's a shapeshifter.
Yeah,
he can change form.
Yeah,
and the idea that he changes between like man and woman in this most recent series is part of like this interesting Trickster dynamic that you're discussing.
Yeah.
Also, Loki from like Norse mythology is also like, he turns into a woman. Like, he turns into like a female horse, and then like has sex with a male horse, and then like gives birth to I think Odin's horse, which is like the 8-legged horse, or I don't know Norse mythology that well, but anyways, he's sort of morphing into different figures, and he morphs into female figures at some point.
Yeah.
And even in a more literal interpretation of this, a lot of trickster figures that we sort of have in our culture, in our society, are very androgynous. You can think of even like David Bowie is like a very androgynous figure.
Oh, okay, this is interesting.
He has kind of like this sort of trickstery archetype about him.
Well, he also like blends things together, not just like this expression of masculine and feminine, but just like looking at his music, how different it was, how revolutionary it was. And he, especially across his like entire career, I think blended things in a way that was so unique and really transformational.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And sort of that blending, that kind of straddling the middle.
Yeah.
For instance, being like a man who sort of dresses like a woman does. Because I think David Bowie would like do things like he would just like wear like dresses around like in his like early career, and grow his hair really long.
Yeah.
And there's kind of notion of like, it's like, well, wait, you can't. You're a man. You can't do that.
Right.
And it's like, but like if you were a woman, also, it's like it's still like, well, okay, but you're not a woman, so it's like there's this weird coming into the middle of like the status quo is being messed with.
Right, especially like
trickster.
Cultural context. What's the rise of David Bowie? Early 70s, late 60s, maybe.
Just barely. I think 69 at the earliest. But like he was getting famous around 79, 72, I think.
So it's like what?
Sorry, 71, 72.
Culture in society didn't look the way it does now, where there's much more of this openness of expression, and there's been a lot of change in the idea of gender roles or things like that.
Yeah.
But a lot of those early artistic types, I think, paved the way for society to come into contact with something totally new.
Right.
And it's about the straddling of the realms. Right.
Messing with the status quo.
Yeah.
A lot of the early sort of rock and roll stuff that was going on in the 60s and 70s was kind of like rebelling against the structures of society that say, you can't grow your hair long.
Yeah.
It's like, well, these rock stars are growing their hair long. It's like, what are you doing? You can't. And so they're almost like, even just like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, like they're kind of like these trickster characters. I was going to just say,
like, look at okay, this is interesting because we really want to do like an episode or a live stream on the Beatles, but like you think about
or the band as an archetype in general.
But you think about the evolution of the Beatles, who started out as just like really like clean cut, they're nice bowl haircuts, their suits, but they were always very antagonistic. They were
Oh,
always
yeah.
very
John Lennon
trickstery.
especially, which is like,
Like, watch some interviews with them.
Yeah.
They're not, I mean, they were good boys, but really, I think from pretty early on, I think what made them interesting, what really sort of shook things up is how they would push back. You know, you watch them in these interviews and they're answering in ways that are just kind of like, they're acting kind of like assholes, honestly, or
Totally.
they're making fun of the situation that
Right.
they're in.
Yeah.
And so they have like a verbal communication of what they're doing. That's very trickstery. And then you have the evolution of their music, which went from not even being music that they wrote to totally transforming what rock music even is.
yeah.
And the image too. Anyways, I should stop there because I could keep going. But
Yeah, the point is like there's sort of a rebelling against the status quo,
Right.
and like, you know, the older generations might wag their finger and be like, "You can't do that,"
Right.
like, but that's the whole point, and this rebelling against what is considered to be the way things are, the way
Yeah.
things should be,
Right.
what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I mean, that's like the '60s onward.
true.
So it's like
Yeah.
the 20th century has this huge like hermetic kind of shift
Hmm.
in which like it's like very liminal. 60s are sort of disrupting what's traditional and what's considered okay.
Yeah.
And there's danger in that, and that's like why, you know, we're making so many connections here, which I think is really interesting. But like that's why the trickster is good, because he's sort of disrupting things and leading to all these insights.
Yeah.
60s is this explosion of new ideas, new knowledge, and a lot of it's really powerful, really beautiful, but also a lot of it goes way too far.
True,
And it can be
true.
so destructuring,
Right.
so eroding to the structure that things just
Yeah.
collapse
Right.
into like this horrible mess.
Right.
And so the trickster in shadow, let's say, if you're
Yeah.
too trickstery,
Yeah.
you become like the Joker, right? And the
okay.
Joker's like just wants to watch the world burn.
Right.
So it's like there's like a shadow side of the trickster
Right.
of like it's not always
Because
great
he's
to be a
dancing
trickster.
with chaos.
Yeah.
That's part of one of the realms that he straddles. It's like, here's order, here's what's normal, here's what is agreed upon. Time to shake things up. It's like, how do you do that? You open the floodgates, you know, you
Right.
let the animal loose,
Right.
you pull the veil up.
Yeah.
And that chaotic aspect, you have to mediate that. The same goes for personal work.
Yeah.
It's like, I think that's why the trickster is so powerful as a figure of depth psychology
Yeah.
as well. It's because you kind of have to embody the trickster or allow that in to entertain these ideas that have been in shadow or
Yeah.
that have been so unconscious in your life. Yet if you open the floodgates of the unconscious, it's like, what happens? Like, you feel like you're drowning. It's like Solutio. It's the flood myth. I am just being overwhelmed,
Right.
you know, or everything gets burned down too quickly.
Yeah.
So that mediating,
Right.
so highly important to this, but it can be really difficult to navigate
Yeah.
because it's powerful. It's a really powerful archetype.
Yeah. I mean, you can see it on the collective societal level too. I mean, like, you know, you want to look at like the Bolshevik revolution in Russia in like, you know, 1918. It's like, that's like a revolutionary change that you could say is sort of like, well, it's like the 60s, like just like taking down like the old structure, but it's like millions of people died in that revolution
Yeah.
and the decades that followed as a result of like tearing down the structure.
Right.
It's like, it's not always good.
Right.
You can think of the trickster. You're at a party, someone pulls out a squirt gun and it's like squirting people and people are like, oh, stop it. Like, and it's like kind of funny. It's like
Right.
trickstery. And it's like,
Yeah.
actually it's like, oh, people are actually lighting up and having more fun now. Like
Right.
everyone's busting out squirt guns now. But you could also imagine someone coming with like, you know, like a fire hose connected
Yeah.
to a fire hydrant outside and be like, hey guys, and like blasting people and like actually like maybe like injuring people with
True.
all the water.
Yeah.
It's like, is that still trickstery?
Yeah.
It's like, no, it's just destructive.
Right.
So there's like a fine line, that balance
Yeah.
between loosening things up, shaking things up, and actually just causing things to collapse that you need
Yeah.
to be careful about.
Yeah. I think before we close out today, I would want to talk to you a little bit about what it feels like to be in touch with and to embody some aspects of the trickster. Because I think that
Yeah.
is something, of all the people that I know, you have pretty prevalent, strong trickster tendencies.
Yeah, for sure.
And, you know, what does it feel like for you? When does it come out the most?
Yeah, I mean, it probably doesn't come out too strongly over the podcast like this, over the internet, but probably a little bit. And this episode's kind of morphed into a conversation about the trickster.
Yes.
And sort of departed away from Hermes, but it's all connected.
It is.
So there's different aspects of my personality that are clearly we're obviously all related because they're all in me, but there is a deep yearning for truth and deep yearning for beauty and deep yearning for what's real. And that's sort of like a more sort of conscious, in control version of me.
Yeah.
But along with that, and I don't think it's a different thing, but it's related to it, there is a huge trickster version of me that just instinctually wants to go into social scenes and shake them up and do things that are kind of silly and over the top and absurd and be kind of unacceptable or mess with what's considered polite.
Yeah.
And usually, I mean, it's I think it's like virtuous all the time, you know, doing stuff like going streaking, for instance, is like something I've like done a lot. And I did that a lot in college because I thought it was like so hilarious to like run through someone's like dorm hall, like completely naked. And they're just like, what the, you know, like they watch someone go by and it's just like, it was just funny to me. Yeah. And there is this kind of like messing with the rules. Like that's not acceptable, but at the same time, like it's kind of funny and people like think it's kind of like, people are like lightening up because of this.
Right.
Or, you know, doing things like going around and just like messing with people at a party to get them to lighten up and, you know, putting things in their pockets that aren't supposed to be there or something, or dancing, being the first person to start dancing and dancing in a really ridiculous way to like a really ridiculous song.
Yeah. I think there's a way that I see your tricksteriness that combines like the really powerful thinking function that you have, that it's like the mind trick that you'll play on people, or the way in which you'll present something that's forcing them to see it in a way that they either really didn't want to see it or didn't realize, and how that passes that boundary into probably some uncomfortable or shadowy territory. Right. But it can be so revelatory.
It can be revelatory, and there is the instinct to provide people with a revelation or an insight or wisdom, like wake up, like the trickster wants to wake you up.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can go too far. And I've said this before, is like, there are times, because the trickster comes out very easily when I'm drinking. And there are times when I drink way too much and the trickster actually just becomes like really, really difficult and annoying for people.
Right. Yeah.
Where it's like, Arran, like, this isn't funny anymore, and like no one's having a good time anymore. Like you need to calm down.
Dark shadow valence trickster Arran.
Right, and it's never like destructive or anything, but it's still kind of like it's shaking things up so much that people are actually getting like really annoyed.
Yeah, annoyed.
But yeah, I don't know. That's just it's all interrelated. The wisdom, the tricksteriness, and the diving into the unconscious. I mean, the way that we're exploring the shadow, I'm deeply interested in that. There is sort of, and that's kind of like the Hermes figure is kind of like the truth, the tricksteriness, and the connection to the underworld. Yeah. And all three of those things are actually intertwined. They're sort of in one package, depending on like the valence of the archetype at any given moment.
Yeah. So do you feel that the more that we explore, the more that you've explored this idea of Hermes, that you've felt that affinity towards him, that connection? Because I think maybe we haven't really gotten into this very much, but there's also this very Apollonian aspect of you.
But that's the conscious side of me, right?
Yeah.
And that's the side of me that I more readily identify with, which Apollo. Is like truth, light, beauty,
art, sensitivity, all these things. Yeah.
It's like I'm Apollo, but at the same time, it's like, no, you're only Apollo some of the time. And there's like another side of you that's like very Hermes. Yeah. And there's another side of you that's like very Lucifer, like, you know. But
the Luciferian principle is also very trickstery.
Absolutely.
It's also this aspect that really kind of reveals or wanted to change things up or challenge the status quo. Yeah. And we don't see that as much with Hermes as a figure that he's just like going against Zeus. In fact, he's in line with that principle of like the god of gods. He's his herald. He's kind of working in conjunction with him. But there's all these other ways that I think Hermes presses those uncomfortable boundaries and allows things to be shaken up. So it's helpful to sort of trace the other types of figures that relate to this, because the nature is there. And Hermes really does kind of, as we've talked about this entire episode, just scale all of these different, really dynamic, really interesting areas. And I think his ability to tap into anywhere from like the underworld and the crossing of souls to flocks and shepherds and thieves and commerce, it speaks to the liminality of him, you know, because they're pretty disparate, and some of the other ones with other gods are like the connections like a little bit more linear, I would say.
Yeah.
But Hermes especially, I think, just brings a lot of color and, you know, dynamic, psychological and symbolic essence to the pantheon. So Hermes, you know, how do we see him in our life? How can you embody him more? You know, how can you read those stories and understand it and sort of invite that in? I think it's important to contemplate that nature of the psychopomp, of the trickster, of the one who's mediating, but also his more grounded aspects. I think as a structure, as like a map, he offers us a lot to consider in our lives, and in ways in which we can invite in these aspects that are bringing depth and transformation.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
If you'd like to keep up to date with our projects, attend one of our live events, or work one-on-one with myself or Arran, head to www.goldenshadow.org.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.